Welcome back to my 2022 NFL exit report. And now we're on the LA Chargers. And this has been something that I've been excited about for a long time. I get to hook up with Matt Landis, who's well known in the props and hop circles, decent appearances, and so on. Pleasure to have an aspiring, up and coming handicapper, somebody who's really networked in the field, such as Matt on the show. Matt, how are you?
Ron, I'm connecting with you, so I must be doing pretty well. It might be a mixed bag with the Chargers, but anytime we can connect, always a good time. Thanks for having me on.
Uh, it's a pleasure. And unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. And we have to start. I almost apologize for starting in this way, but I like to start the show by looking back at where we were a year ago. And where we were a year ago was a little bit of a dark place for Chargers fans. A promising season, last game of the season against the Raiders, 70th minute of the game, a field goal hits, and the Chargers, unfortunately, are staying home for the holidays. Probably the seventh time in the last 8 seasons they had metrics and stats that were worthy of being in the playoffs, but didn't get there. Can you remember back what your thoughts were in terms of where the Chargers were headed after that game? Were they going up, down, sideways?
Yeah, both as a bettor and a fan, I liked the direction that things were trending for them a year ago at this time. And I think as a fan, it was obviously heartbreaking to see the way the season ended. But from a handicapping standpoint, and also trying to be more analytical in general, I recall coming out of that game, one specific point that got a lot of attention was Brandon Staley calling the final timeout that he used, and then the Raiders ripped off a big run, got into field goal range that eventually ended the Chargers season. But actually, as a bettor, I came out of that more optimistic than a lot of people did, because as I recall, Brandon Staley explained using that timeout to get his best run defenders on the field. He, I think from a process standpoint, pretty correctly gauged what the Raiders were looking to do. Unfortunately, especially before the offseason spending spree they went on, they just were outgunned when it came to the ability to make stops on defense when it mattered most on the ground game. And they didn't fully fix it this past season. I'm sure we can get to that a bit later. But I thought, okay, we've got a first-year head coach who was pretty aggressive, but mostly analytically sound, I thought, even to the extent that he used a timeout in a key moment that, because of the way it worked out after the fact, he got ridiculed for it. But despite a really heartbreaking result, I felt like there was some really sound process in play. I thought there was a lot to build on there. And from a roster construction standpoint, I think there was some pretty good building done. Maybe a bit of regression when it comes to the process made by the head coach. But this time last year was thinking, all right, tough result, but definitely saw quite the upward trajectory with Justin Herbert on a rookie deal, all kinds of salary cap space. Really strong, I thought, first year process for Brandon Staley as a head coach. So yeah, for such a tough way to end the season, I thought things were still moving in a pretty positive direction overall.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. I like the roster building that this team does. Unlike most teams, they hit on their first round picks and a lot of their second round picks too. So they've got some really really good building blocks on the roster. Now we can probably revisit Staley a lot during the show. I don't want to dwell on him too much. The decisions that I didn't like from him during the season were generally end of first half decisions when clock was in a different state and when you don't want to give an extra time to kick the field goal because the other team's not going to have enough time to move it in 30 seconds, that kind of thing. I think he could have learned there. I look back at somebody like Zach Taylor of Cincinnati. Everybody had him on the chopping block prior to 2021, and now he's thriving as a head coach. The hope is that Staley can make that same jump after his second season going into the third season.
I like that comparison. I think that Zach Taylor adjusting in season this year, after a couple games, it sounded like, hey, if Cincinnati's under center, they're running the ball. If they're out of the shotgun, they're going to throw it. And just mixing up some tendencies went a long way. So some basic stuff like that, I think there's plenty of opportunity for Staley. But yeah, to your point, seeing somebody who, even though the Bengals went to the Super Bowl last season, not a lot of people thought it was, due in as large part to Zach Taylor as a lot of appearances that head coaches get in a game like the Super Bowl. So yeah, if I had my way, maybe Brandon Staley wouldn't still be patrolling the sidelines for the Chargers, but there's room for growth. And we have seen, to your point, some young coaches going from year 2 to year 3 show some pretty eye-opening improvements. So that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, it's hard in this league where it's a not for long league. You don't get a lot of chances, and he's going to have a chance this third year. So the roster took a little bit of construction, not just the coaching staff, but the roster itself. They had Khalil Mack, for example, and that was something that was important to me because I think they've underachieved, the Chargers have, in terms of putting a consistent pass rusher on opposing quarterbacks. So they signed Khalil Mack. There were probably a couple other signings that escape me right now. I like the drafting of Zion Johnson in terms of the offensive guard. How did you assess the roster construction in the offseason?
Yeah, I will say first and foremost, there are people probably a million times better equipped than I am to answer this question. But because I pay such close attention to this team, I'll say that I liked the Khalil Mack move a lot when it happened. And I know there were concerns about the amount of games he had missed previously and was he past his prime. But I feel like he was consistently available. And without looking at any advanced metrics or anything like that, watching the team, I felt like he did about as much as somebody reasonably could have expected for them. Another defensive piece they added, Kyle Van Noy, that kind of went under the radar. But when Joey Bosa went down, Van Noy slotted in and really took well to rushing the passer. And before they had Van Noy, it was pretty much Bosa and Khalil Mack and who else. So it was really nice to see, a low-key offseason move really paying dividends as the season got rolling. Johnson, the guard they took in the first round, I think that was a pretty universally praised pick when the Chargers made it. A few years ago, thinking a mid-first round draft pick on an offensive lineman who's not a left tackle, that might raise some eyebrows. But we've seen some cases of, okay, not dipping too early into the first round, but yeah, mid-first round, if you've got an interior offensive lineman who shows a lot of promise, it's not unconscionable to make that pick now. Johnson had, I think, a very up and down rookie season. So relative to the expectation and how safe that pick was presumed to be, maybe, the jury is still out, but maybe some room for a second year bump. And I wouldn't be surprised to see it. It's tough to hold everybody to the standard of Rashawn Slater from the previous year being an all-pro right out of the gate, anchoring the offensive line. So I generally have felt good with the way that they've built the team around Herbert. I do think that more speed at wide receiver really, really would have been helpful. And it's tough when you're paying Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, what they're each making. There goes a significant chunk of your salary cap space to that position already. But somebody to take the lid off of a defense or at least bring that deep threat. I know Jalen Guyton was kind of that guy and he got hurt in week 3 against Jacksonville. So maybe they thought they had something there. And unfortunately, he just wasn't available for much of this season. But I don't think that the primary reason the Chargers aren't one of the 2 teams left standing has too much to do with the way that they went about attacking roster construction this past offseason.
Yeah, you really hit it with the speed at wide receiver. It's an area that I've harped on them for years to add in that area, but they have wonderful wide receivers when healthy in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. So you have somebody with a little bit more of a star stature than Guyton roaming the field deep to keep the defenses honest. That would really add something there. Typically at this point, go ahead.
I was just going to say, with the Chiefs, we saw Patrick Mahomes lose a downfield threat, and the offense went from, okay, we're not going to be the most explosive in the league to we'll be one of the most efficient in the league. And it's really worked. I mean, Patrick Mahomes is a one of one in terms of what he can do. So it's not fair to expect, even as much promise as Justin Herbert has shown, it's not fair to expect that. Kind of like your parallel to Zach Taylor improving in year 3. I think, okay, we've seen an elite offense go from losing its biggest downfield threat to still staying, more than relevant in this league. So it's possible to thrive without it. But with Herbert, still they're going to get him an extension this offseason. We'll see what that looks like. But they're still going to have, I think some flexibility before they're really paying him a premium in a couple years. Anything they can do, not just the focus they had this past offseason on the defensive side, but to get him more support in the offensive side of the ball in the passing game with a new offensive coordinator. We can probably touch on Kellen Moore later.
Yeah.
I think that it's not a deal breaker. The Chiefs have shown that if you lose an elite speed receiver, your offense isn't necessarily doomed, but that might be more the exception than the rule when we're talking Patrick Mahomes making that magic happen.
Yeah, Kansas City's been aggressive in the trade market and in the draft market, and they've really done a great job adding speed to their team, built around speed, especially defensively. And the Chargers have been efficient in the draft market. I'd like to see them get a little bit more aggressive in that area. Usually at this time, I talk with the team exit reports, and I give the team keys that I put on my seasonal sheets, these huge sheets that are blank in July and August and are completely stoked with information by the time we reach February, because I put in everything and I matched it all up and so on. But on my team sheet in August, the keys that I had, we mentioned this one already, would Khalil Mack be the answer to an improved pass rush? The second key is one I want to discuss with you a little bit: home field advantage. Whenever we see the Pittsburgh Steelers, we know they travel well. Green Bay Packers travel well, Dallas Cowboys, and so on. I keep waiting for the Charger fan base to show up. Now, home field advantage in general is only worth about 1.5 at most these days. It's really been downsized. But is there anything to that home field advantage that's hurting the Chargers, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's tough to quantify, but I think that just using the eye test, as much as that can sound like the antithesis of somebody who strives to be analytical in the way they look at things, would say to use that eye test and your ears as well. Watch a Chargers primetime game at SoFi Stadium, and it's not uncharacteristic for them to have to go to something like a silent snap count on offense. And I think about conversations I had about this topic years ago with the late, great sports betting legend, David Malinsky. And he would often refer to, home field advantage as the mainstream way of putting it, but more so being a road team disadvantage when it came to this dynamic when we're handicapping.
Right.
And that could be traveling to an unfamiliar venue or a certain climate that wasn't favorable or the crowd noise. All of these factors don't really seem to work in the Chargers' favor. A part of it, I mean, there are even NFC teams they'll play where instead of having a huge edge in familiarity, some of these teams might have been at SoFi recently to play the Rams. When it comes to playing conditions, it's in a pretty controlled environment. I guess technically it's not a dome, but more or less it's an indoor, well-controlled, playing environment over there at SoFi. And then the crowd noise, if the offense ever has to struggle to communicate on its home turf, that's doing them no favors. So still, they're not traveling when they're playing at home, and there's probably a smidge of home field advantage we can give them. But a lot of the factors that I think probably contribute to what Dave Malinsky referred to as the road team disadvantage don't really apply so much to road teams when they're taking on the Chargers.
Wow, those are fantastic points. I hadn't even thought about it in all my years of doing this in terms of the road team disadvantage, the controlled environment. And you bring up an exceptional point. Happens with the Giants and the Jets a lot when you play in the same stadium. The team that plays in the same stadium as the visitor, the second time they come in, look up their win percentage. It's pretty good because they have that familiarity. So excellent point in terms of that. Couple of additional keys before I get to something very uncomfortable. Stopping the run. That was something that I wanted to see the Chargers do better at. They didn't exactly do that in 2021 or in 2022. And I was a little concerned with the change in right tackle with injuries happening in that particular position. But I've gone almost 14 minutes and I'm finally getting to this point. Those who know me, the elephant in the room. 32, 29, 31, 32, 22, 29, 32, the special teams play. And they hired a new special teams coordinator. Of course, we have hindsight now because we know how the 2022 season played out. But what was holding me back, no matter how much I love the roster and I love Justin Herbert, is I couldn't pull the trigger because special team play. When was it going to be better? How much value in your handicapping, how much value do you put on special teams? And was this an area that you were looking closely at with the Chargers, especially with some preseason woes that happened?
Yeah, as a handicapper, definitely thanks to knowing you, I put more emphasis on it than I did before. I still don't have a model that exactly quantifies it, but it has become much more a part of my consciousness. And you touched on some preseason question marks right after we had a meetup with some other like-minded LA sports bettors prior to the season kicking off. There was a preseason game against the Cowboys in which I think there was a kickoff and a punt return brought back for a touchdown. And this, with a new special teams coordinator and some investments they had made, it was such an ominous sign. If I recall correctly, you said that if the Chargers could just finish top 19 in special teams, you thought that they would win the AFC West. And they made the playoffs with a top 19 finish. So I think that you were fairly on target with that remark. But when it came to the special teams unit this year, I think that there were dividends paid from those investments. New coordinator, positions. I should know these guys' names as a fan of the team, or at least as somebody who bet on them from time to time. I don't have that in the, back pocket right now, but at punter and long snapper, I think they made some investments to bring somebody in, looking at from the time the ball is snapped to the time a punt is in the air. How quickly can we pull off that operation? From a long snapping perspective, it's probably the last position that people ever think about. But if I recall correctly, the Chargers made an investment there, and also bringing in a punter who gets really good hang time, so that if their coverage unit was leaky, well, if you force the opposition into a lot of fair catches, that's not going to rear its head as often. So I think that really did pay off. I think there was some skill and some good process in play there that paid off. And then there were some good breaks too. I mean, it could have been a bad break when they lost Dustin Hopkins after a very memorable Monday night game against the Broncos when he was kicking field goals on one leg. And then they brought in, eventually Cameron Dicker settled in. And until, one unfortunate kick in the wild card round, he was really lights out for them. So getting him off the street and seeing the way he performed seemed more fortuitous than anything. And after all the misfortune they've had on special teams over the years, I think we can, maybe chalk that up as regression to the mean and not hold it against them too much from an organizational standpoint. And then last thing I'll note on this, there was also some good fortune on special teams. If we look at that Monday night game against the Broncos, Denver muffing a punt that set the Chargers up for the game winner in overtime. Against the Browns early in the season, Cleveland missing a late field goal that probably would have won the game for them. So there were some big swings that in previous years have worked against the Chargers. And this year it seemed like some big missed field goals or muff punts worked in their favor, at least throughout much of the regular season. So good fortune, plus I think some good process, bringing in some key pieces aside from, everybody knows Justin Tucker is a great kicker and you want the best place kicker you can have. But the whole special teams operation beyond that, when it comes to place kicking, punting, returns, and coverage, just not having any major liabilities there really went a long way for them this past season.
Yeah, it sure is nice for Charger fans to see problems on the other side of the ball instead of the other teams, instead of them making the mistakes. And a common misconception is special teams is, well, how well did your kicker do? Did he make a clutch kick and stuff like that? Really, when you're handicapping special teams, you have to look at punt protection. You have to look at kickoff return coverage, who your gunner is, all these different things. It's really more than just, can your kicker make a 35-yard field goal? And I think that's something that I've incorporated into my handicapping. It is hard to quantify, and it's something that, for me, just kind of the tip. I don't care if you're 13th in special team rating or 23rd in special team rating. What I want to know is who are the top 5 and the bottom 5, and where's the separation marks, because that's the units that will let teams down repeatedly. And Green Bay and the Chargers were in that mix for years and years and years. Season win decisions. As I said, I sat on the sidelines. Anything that you did before the season with futures with the Chargers?
I really didn't. I would have loved to, because after last season, as we touched on, I felt pretty optimistic, but the market was right there with me. I think the one move I made was there was a point at which the Chargers were a longer shot to win the Super Bowl than the Bengals. And I just put a small flyer on it. And as it turns out, the Chargers should have been a longer shot than Cincinnati. But the way the Bengals had gotten to the Super Bowl last year, a lot of late turnovers, overcoming 1 million sacks every game on Joe Burrow. And I think the Bengals really addressed the offseason well. So, looking back on it, maybe Cincinnati should have had even shorter odds than they did. But at the time, I thought the Bengals might be due for some negative regression. The Chargers could be in line for some positive regression. Both really good quarterbacks out of that same draft class. And so aside from a really small flyer on the Chargers to win the Super Bowl that I never expected to cash, a part of it, as much as I try to be objective in my betting, if we ever do see the year that the Chargers hoist the Lombardi Trophy, even if it's a small bet, I would love to have some sort of ticket handy just to say that I got some sort of payout for that and was a believer the whole time. Sometimes I don't feel like the biggest believer. I mean, I couldn't get to the window on regular season wins or a lot of the more standard off-season bets just because the market seems so bullish on the Chargers as it does every year. And I just feel like, when are we going to learn? I mean, it seems like people know, oh, it's the Chargers charging against the Raiders last year when all they needed was a tie, against Jacksonville this year after the 27-0 playoff lead. And it's such a heartbreaking, high-profile end to the season. Yet come July or August every year, it seems like people are cutting in line to bet them over regular season win totals and to back them in the futures market. And I just try not to get too heavily involved there unless I think I have a clear edge, and just didn't see that with the Chargers this time around. So fortunately, as a fan, the end of the season was heartbreaking. As a bettor, next to no impact on the bankroll.
Yeah, I mean, same for me. To be optimistic about a team and to play the overs is a tough task for me. I have mentioned that I had 15 season win totals going in the year, and 12 of them were unders. The 3 overs were the most I've ever had in overs for a decade. I generally only have 1 or 2 because the market is always overpricing them. And just in the AFC East alone, you're talking about teams priced at 10, 10 and a half, Denver and the Chargers, Kansas City ahead of that. And in Vegas, the Raiders were 9, but they were 8.5 in a lot of places. And the under was minus 120 and stuff like that. So you can't have everybody win every game, but that's sometimes the way the public looks at it. So looking at the season, let's separate it by the first 16 games. Let's not cover the 17th game yet. They were making a lot of strides during the year. Khalil Mack started off pretty strong. The sack ratio did start out pretty good. And then injuries hit like crazy. And I'm not one, I usually say injuries happen to everybody, forget it. But the Chargers, to me, were one of 2 or only 3 teams that really got hit. When you lose your left tackle and your entire top 2 wide receivers that are just so impactful, Derwin James was banged up, Bosa was banged up, and so on. I'd have to say that the Chargers did very well in those first 16 games. How did you see the season play out?
Yeah, if you would have told me that they would have had, and not to mention Justin Herbert didn't miss any meaningful time, but he was playing for about half the season, very limited due to a brutal rib injury. Slater going down week 3, Corey Linsley in and out of the lineup for a while as an anchor to that line at center, Trey Pipkins at right guard. He had some games that he was either limited or out altogether. The wide receivers you mentioned, Donald Parham at tight end was, in and out of the lineup defensively with Bosa. Derwin James, you mentioned missing some time. J.C. Jackson, the most high-profile offseason signing they made, not really being a factor at all. He missed the start of the season, came back for a hot minute, wasn't so effective, and then unfortunately got injured again. So if you were to tell me that just about everything that could have gone wrong would go wrong from an injury standpoint to key players at key positions, and they would still make the playoffs, I think I would have been over the moon. So as much as it's tough to think about what could have been, maybe with a more aggressive offensive coordinator, and we'll see how that plays out moving forward, what could have been with, all the pieces on defense that they had, how do they not hold a 27-point lead with little more than a half to go in a playoff game? There's a lot that seems upsetting about the way the season went down, but at the same time, to see everything they overcame, I do feel like, again, maybe it's tougher to quantify as a bettor. I can't put my finger on it or say what it's worth, but maybe there's something to the mentality, almost like the Steelers. They, I don't know if you've heard this, Ron, but Mike Tomlin doesn't have losing seasons. And I think there is something to the fact that, not that he's necessarily insistent on, we must always be above 500, but the way he maximizes talent. And like Tomlin with Staley this year, much more than I would have anticipated after his first season, there were very questionable things from a game management standpoint. So I think there was a lot to be desired there, but there must have been something going on with having command of the locker room or getting buy-in from the depth needed on this roster to hold it together after everybody seemed to go down during the first half of the season. So a bit of a mixed bag. I think the way that they overcame injuries overall hopefully got some guys some playing time that will be very valuable moving forward. And then if they can be anywhere near full strength next season, we might be looking at some different outcomes, at least at various points for this team.
Yeah, I think they really should be proud of the way those games went. Again, I think special teams contributed. Just the fact that we didn't talk about them, and unofficially they were somewhere around 9th or so in special team rating, to go from 31st, 32nd to 9th. they weren't losing games, and they could have lost games with all this backup talent and the issues that they had to deal with plugging players in and out of the lineup. Justin Herbert on a rookie contract certainly helps that. And so moving forward, they may not be able to afford these injuries, but hopefully moving forward, they don't have as many injuries.
One
Week
question for you, Ron,
18.
if I may. If I may jump in here as the guest, the host and me can't help but ask you, when it comes to special teams, you talk about a big swing from the dregs of the league to a top 10 unit. As I understand it, special teams is maybe the least sticky phase of the game. Offense tends to be more predictive. Defense can have its swings, and special teams can be very volatile year over year. I understand that, when we had somebody like Belichick and his staff in New England for years, I think there's been some turnover along the staff, but the Patriots were consistently elite. The Ravens, not just with Justin Tucker, but with Harbaugh calling the shots, they're consistently good. Yeah. That seems to be the exception to the norm, and there's a lot of fluctuation in the middle year over year. So did you see anything with the Chargers that you thought was sustainable from a special team standpoint, or how much of it might be, hey, Denver muffed a punt that really swung the outcome of a Monday night game. Cleveland missed a field goal that was really pivotal. It seemed like they did get a lot of big breaks and crucial moments as well.
Yeah, I wish it was more quantifiable like the college game, because these college coaches, the special team coaches, they really make these guys, even if they change schools, they upgrade their special team unit by leaps and bounds. There's 5 or 6 of them that consistently should be in the must-have list for these teams. With the Chargers, there was more about how they used, believe it or not, the 2020 draft. I think let's the 2021 draft. Even though they finished horrible in 2021, they drafted 5 guys who played prominent roles in special teams that year. And maybe because they still had the other coach, and maybe because one of their primary guys, I think it was Nick Neiman, got hurt right away and he couldn't contribute in terms of how he does on special teams. I just thought they put more of a focus on it. So it's just a combined team effort. Do you put your best players on special teams? Do you draft for special teams? How do you use your 5th round, your 6th round, and 7th round in the draft? If you're a team that has like 5 or 6 draft choices, you can't spend as much time on special teams. But if you covet draft choices, like Baltimore does, for example, what you said, they usually have 9, 10 picks. And so they can afford to have special team talent, people drafted just to help that unit. And that's where I think it makes a difference.
Got it. Well, hopefully there's some sustainability there, because it sounds like those draft picks, especially the later round guys taken in the last year or two, probably not going anywhere anytime soon.
No, and they're always replaceable. So they have to do a good job on special teams or they're out of a job. I hate to bring this up again to Charger fans, but in week 18, Staley made the conscious decision to play his veterans a very long time in the game. Now, I'm a proponent of not necessarily sitting your guys like the Giants did right from the start. I like these guys to have that routine and get in 1 quarter's worth of action or 2 series worth of action so that you're still in rhythm in the game. But Staley played these guys with no change in playoff status. 3.5 quarters, I believe, most of these guys, including Justin Herbert. Obviously, we saw what happened to Mike Williams. One of their key defensive players got hurt during the game as well. How did you feel about that?
Man, I was easy the second Justin Herbert went onto the field for the first series of the game. I hear you on, okay, if it's just to get them some reps, fine, a series or 2. If something happens, okay. If you have a sound process and you're just looking for 1 or 2 series and you play it safe but keep in rhythm, that's cool. There's just such asymmetric risk in my mind when it comes to keeping somebody in rhythm versus potentially getting them injured, especially when it's the case not of, hey, you're taking the field and most likely this is what's going to happen or probably this will happen. You knew when that game started, the Chargers are the 4 seed. They're going to be playing, they're the 5 seed. They're going to be playing at the 4 seed, Jacksonville, next weekend. It's going to be back-to-back road games. They were basically gifted a bye week and didn't do anything with it. And that was really tough to see. Literally a back-breaking decision when we think about Mike Williams and what happened in that game. And even though Justin Herbert didn't get injured, I believe there was a roughing the passer call in Denver. He was taking some big hits. And Joey Bosa tweaked a groin injury and they took him out of the game and said it was planned anyway. I feel like there was a lot of trying to save face after the game, even initially severely downplaying the Mike Williams injury. And I just don't understand. As much as I wanted to applaud the team's process from a roster construction standpoint, or the way that they held it together with a lot of early and mid-season injuries, I'm trying to be open-minded. I'm not in that building, so somebody knows a whole lot more than I do. I just can't figure out what the rationale was for that Week 18 approach in Denver, because if you're playing to truly win the game, it sounded like afterwards Staley was saying they wanted to win, the guys are competitors. Well, then why are you pulling them after 3.5 quarters?
Yeah.
Or the argument, if you're playing to win and you still lose a meaningless game, is that not more deflating mentally than the detriment could be of hey, just resting guys when they would have rather played? You can never please everybody. If they rested everybody and then they lost in Jacksonville, the argument would have been that they were rusty and they should have played the week before. So I get that hindsight's always 2020, but when the starters were on the field in Denver before Mike Williams got hurt, I was really upset by the process. I try to keep an open mind and understand that, Staley, his staff, a lot of people know so much more than I ever will. So I want to keep myself in my place, but trying to figure it out the best I could. I'm still at a loss. And I feel like the way that you outlined the approach, maybe play a series or two. If Staley's not around after this next season, then, maybe somebody should give you a call, because if it's game number 17 of the regular season like that, maybe Mike Williams is there. Maybe they don't fumble the jet sweep to a practice squad guy who had to play in part because Mike Williams was hurt near the end of the first half that set up the Jags touchdown going into halftime. There were so many small things that happened that it's not just Mike Williams had basically a broken back suffered in Denver. It's that guys got more banged up. There's a cumulative effect. It's all, so tough to quantify, but I just saw it as a situation with so much asymmetric risk, and they took the side with very little reward, relatively speaking, as far as I could see.
I personally got blindsided by all that because I thought it was a foregone conclusion these guys would be out before the half. I had Denver. That was my top position the first week. That week, that game, I had Denver plus the points. I had Denver in the third quarter. I had Denver in the fourth quarter. There's no way that the Chargers need the game, and Denver's, they're playing for their roster spots really in that particular game, and possibly cold weather and all those other things. So I kind of got blindsided there, but I think there's no question the Chargers would have won against Jacksonville in my mind with a healthy Mike Williams. He's just unguardable on those third down situations. He just boxes out so well, but a little bit unfortunate there. Let's move a little bit past the Jacksonville game. We know how that occurred, but now we have a coordinator change that you hinted at. We've got Kellen Moore in the building. A lot of people were calling for Lombardi's head during the season. What were your thoughts on Lombardi, and where do you see this team now that we have an offseason to look forward to 2023?
Sure. So again, trying to be measured or objective where I can. There's a lot that I don't know, and even though I was very unsatisfied for much of the season with how Lombardi was running the offense, I understand that he knows a lot more than I ever will, and there's certain information that he had that wasn't made available to the public. So there were a lot of injuries. There were certain things that maybe they had to scrap certain parts of the playbook at times. But yeah, I was, as much as I don't want to see anybody get fired or lose a job in any scenario, I was not too sad to see him go. I feel like with Justin Herbert, you basically have a quarterback. Let's make an analogy to cars, somebody with like the tools of a Ferrari. And then you hand Lombardi the keys and he's driving it like a minivan with all these passes behind the line of scrimmage. It just got so tough to watch. I started keeping track of Chargers passes that were completed that went for 2 yards or less. And a surprising amount went for completed passes going for negative yards. And if it's 3rd and 1 and you get a 2-yard completion, that's a good play. But these are, 2nd and 10. There were a lot of 3rd and longs that they threw short of the sticks. And it's not like you've got Jamar Chase who's going to make stuff happen after the catch. These were dump offs that seemed doomed from the start, almost like the way the Vikings playoff run ended against the Giants with the Cousins check down to Hawkinson.
Yeah.
That seemed like that was straight out of the Joe Lombardi playbook. So I am definitely optimistic that Moore is going to be some level of an upgrade. With what he did in Dallas, it's hard to delineate, okay, how much was there pressure from Jerry Jones to feed Ezekiel Elliott because of the big contract? How much meddling did Jason Garrett and Mike McCarthy do because of their offensive backgrounds? We really don't know wherever the Cowboys did things well. Was that because Moore was really brilliant, and where they struggled, was it because people were meddling where they shouldn't have been? I think this will be a chance to get a clean read on his chops as an offensive coordinator, because I really do think that he is going to have the reins with this Chargers team in 2023. But something that bums me out a bit about the decision to not even pursue Sean Payton, as far as I could tell, is that yes, there could be the answer. Hey, Staley schemes up good defensive game plans. He brings a lot to the table in certain aspects. Let's just hire a good offensive coordinator, and that may fix the problem. True, I'll concede that that may fix the problem. But if you've got an offensive coordinator who's as good as you could possibly hope, then guess what? In a year or two, he's going to get calls for head coaching opportunities. And if I recall correctly, Kellen Moore has already interviewed for head coaching positions in the past. So even if he knocks it out of the park, okay, cool. Then in another year or two, you're looking for somebody else. And at a certain point, you can't just keep nailing every hire for that position. So I just feel like it's kind of putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. And I hope it goes well this year. But even if it goes as well as it could possibly go, it doesn't feel like the most possible sustainable environment.
Yeah. Now, those are all good points. You're right. I haven't thought, you're thinking long term. Yeah, if Kellen Moore does his job, he's gone. And then hopefully you just hope that somebody like Justin Herbert drives wide receivers and other people to play with him, much the same way people hopefully will play with guys like Joe Burrow and the other aspiring quarterbacks in the league. 2 games this year against Kansas City, both nail biters. They lost by 3 points each time. I really think this team matches up so well against Kansas City. So let's shoot for the top with this banner down here. Can LA win the AFC West in 2023?
Oh man, I'm not going to say that they can't. I mean, at this stage of the offseason, I might not rule out, certainly Denver with Sean Payton, or who knows what the Raiders are going to do. Like, anything is on the table, and there are surprises every year. It will be weird to me if we ever get to a season where it's not week 3 or week 4 and everybody else is saying how weird things are. There's just so much upheaval and variance from year to year. And with what the Chargers have in place with Herbert and a lot of key players on defense as well, I feel like the skill is there. If a little bit of variance swings their way, I could absolutely see it. And I think back to those Chiefs games you mentioned, the first one they lost in Kansas City. I mean, it was kind of a backdoor cover to lose by 3 with a late touchdown, with Herbert somehow, playing without the left side of his body functioning. But there was a pick 6 where the Chargers were deep in Chiefs territory, about to score a touchdown to perhaps really take control of that game. Mm-hmm. And then there was the Herbert injury. In the second matchup, again, another 3-point loss. Herbert had thrown a go-ahead touchdown pass, near the end of the game. Unfortunately, there was just enough time left for Patrick Mahomes. This might go back to your game management questions. So I think we need to see more competence out of offensive coordinator. And I'm not sure the degree to which we'll see it, but I feel confident that we will see that at least in some way move in the right direction. Staley, that first Chiefs game as well, punting multiple times on 4th and very short from right around midfield. Yeah. And I feel like if you convert one of those, if not both, those are 4th and 1, 4th and 2 with that offense, that should be pretty high percentage. And those could convert into scoring drives. And instead pinning the defense, pinning the Chiefs offense back, saying you trust your defense. I feel like what I would like to see from Staley that could help me more definitively answer this, if you really truly trust your defense, I feel like the answer is not punting on 4th and 1, 4th and 2 at midfield. If you trust your defense and your offense, let Justin Herbert make a play. And if he doesn't, you can trust your defense to take over, even in bad field position, and stop the bleeding. So there are some things that just from an optimal game management standpoint seem to regress pretty heavily this year relative to last year. If they can clean that up, which it doesn't take a genius, I think, to at least make some progress there. If they can clean up some of the game management stuff, if variance breaks their way and they can stay healthier, if Kellen Moore can take the offense to a new level, then absolutely, I think that this team has what it takes. I wouldn't say it's more likely than not to happen because of the Chiefs being in this division, and who knows what Sean Payton might be able to do with Russell Wilson. But I've got to think for any team in a division with the Chiefs, the Chargers are about as squarely in the mix to potentially unseat them sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'm in that ballpark too, cautiously optimistic as well. I think for Staley, know your opponent. If you're playing against Washington, if you're playing against whatever, and you don't feel like you want to go for it 4th and 1, 4th and 2, pen them back. Mm-hmm. But if you're playing against Mahomes, I think your offense has to stay on the field. Go for 7s instead of 3s. Take some chances because Mahomes is on the other side. I think he just has to do a little bit more creative game thinking and not just be stubborn in his way, but know who's on the other side of the ball.
Yeah, and if I may,
So,
I'll point out a parallel to the NFC Championship game. A big talking point going into it was game scheme versus game management. Kyle Shanahan scheming up amazing plays, but Nick Sirianni and the Eagles staff being much more sound when it comes to actually managing the game. Same thing could be
mhm.
said for the Super Bowl. Again, Andy Reid, great play caller, but sometimes he throws a challenge flag that he shouldn't, or can get a little bit cavalier with
Mhm.
timeouts, or a little bit cowardly on fourth down, especially considering Mahomes is his guy. So Brandon Staley, to tie this back to the Chargers conversation and what you just said, Brandon Staley, especially as the season went on, I thought dialed up very good game plans specific to an opponent. The Sunday night game against the Dolphins. Shortly before that, even when they were completely outmatched against the 49ers, and that seemed to be about rock bottom from a health standpoint, that defensive game plan was really, really smart. And there are things he does schematically that I think show a lot of promise. But to me, the difference between applying that skill set to being a really good defensive coordinator and instead being a good head coach would also need to layer in knowing when to go for it. I like your point about knowing when to, accelerate or decelerate when it comes to embracing variance, because yeah, there was a game against Drew Lock a couple years ago for Denver where the Chargers kicked a field goal, 4th and goal from the 1. I'm like, yeah, just take the points. They already had a bit of a lead. Drew Lock's not coming back on you. But
Yeah.
when you've got Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs on the other side, as much as you should probably believe in yourself if you're on any NFL team, you probably also know that, unless you're the Eagles favored in the Super Bowl on a neutral field, you're probably not as talented as Kansas City. So you're going to need to embrace variance. And what's the difference if you lose by 3 or 10 or 20? If you can do anything to increase your odds of winning the game, even if it means also increasing the odds of losing by a bigger margin that's not as aesthetically pleasing, who cares? It all comes down to wins and losses. And there are some things that can be done moving forward to really clean that up 2 games a year against Kansas City.
It's an exciting time, I think, to be a Charger fan because the highs can be really high. Unfortunately, the lows can knock you back into reality. Anything else, final thoughts you have before we put a wrap on this one?
Oh man, I think I just covered all my final thoughts in my long-winded follow-up to your last point.
Even more.
I'm still recovering, still doing some damage control from the way the season ended, but I should be used to it by now. And I think from a betting standpoint, if anything, if the market does what it does every year like clockwork and gets really hot on the Chargers come July or August, I liked your point earlier about from a season wins perspective. It just seems like there's a lot more that can go wrong than can go right. So I wouldn't relish the opportunity to do it, but if people get too hot too quickly on the Chargers, then maybe looking for value to fade them and then let fandom be what it will, but really try to think objectively as a bettor. I think that was a good point on your part, that generally regular season win totals, when you're looking at the market just red hot on a team, there could probably only be value playing a bet like that in one direction.
Yeah. You have to look at the metrics and you have to just see and it says, where's the best price point? Where does it match? And so on. Matt, I absolutely appreciate the time that you've given. I know you're so busy. You've got a lot of stuff going on. Tell everybody, if they don't already follow you, what you're up to this week and what else you have going on.
Sure, thank you. So this week is the continuation of a 2-week series that I've dubbed the Props and Hops Super Bowl Shuffle interview series. I've been so fortunate all season long to be joined twice a week by Zuma and Hitman professional bettors who are 2 of the best in the world at what they do. And I thought that leading up to the Super Bowl, it would be fun to mix things up a little bit, shuffle in some new guests, and go to a daily cadence as we kind of sprint to the finish line here with football season. So by the time people are hearing this conversation, there will also be an episode up with Las Vegas Chris, your partner in crime.
All
And
right.
excited to share that very process-driven conversation with people. And yeah, beyond that, once we hit the off season, I'll be looking to see where there might be value in any NFL draft betting conversations to be had. And then really bringing out some evergreen conversations, people like yourself who have been doing such great work in this space for such a long time. And, whether there are picks to get to for a given slate or just information that can fuel all of our processes, I honestly find the latter to be more rewarding than even really good picks most of the time. So definitely looking to keep it going, not at a daily cadence year round, but certainly at a weekly cadence throughout the off season. So yeah, if people listen to Props and Hops anywhere you get your podcasts, that'll be available on a year round basis, even once we're clear of Super Bowl 57.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I always say trust the process because it's more important to teach people about the process than actually give out a pick for no reason. It's really about something that is more sustainable long term. You and I may have some unfinished business because hopefully we get together again for another meet and greet so I can wear a purchased Charger hat in honor of them making the playoffs and actually doing something right on special teams. So I look forward to joining you live in person and hopefully some more chats down the road. So again, big thank you to Matt for contributing to the LA Charger NFL season exit report. I'll be back with more season exit reports as we go along. Thanks for watching, and we'll see everybody soon.